Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for clinicians in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medical legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. My name's Dr. Lucy Gibbard. I'm a GP from Taranaki, and I'm also one of the medical legal consultants at Medical Protection Society. And I'm joined today by my colleagues. I'll get them to introduce themselves, actually. Sam.
So I'm Dr. Sam King. I work with Lucy at MPS, and I'm also a GP in South Auckland.
I'm Dr. Chow Yen Chen. I'm an anaesthetist, and I also work with Sam and Lucy at Medical Protection.
Oh, hello, and I'm Sean O'Sullivan. I'm a partner in the firm of Watt & Carney. We're the panel lawyers for the Medical Protection Society, so we work with Sam, Lucy and Chow Yen as well.
Thanks, Sean. Nice to see you, everybody. So today we're moving on to our second part on toxic workplaces, specifically to talk about a bit more about bullying and harassment and about building a better team dynamic. And look, I think we need to be clear today that from Chow, Sam and my point of view, this is not really our area of expertise. As a medical indemnity organisation, we tend to cover clinical issues and medical legal issues that relate to clinical work. But in general, our indemnity doesn't cover personal conduct unless it's raised with a regulator such as the Medical Council. So that means that allegations of bullying and harassment which don't involve patient care and are raised within the workplace, such as a hospital or a practice, well then generally MPS is not going to get involved. In hospitals, there are unions such as RDA, Stones and ASMS, and they may well get involved. And in general practice, we'd normally advise our members to get advice from an employment lawyer. So as I say, bullying and harassment doesn't tend to be within MPS's remit.
No, but we do offer this free phone advice for our members. So for any of our members, if you speak to one of us and we think that you need to speak to one of our employment guys, you get a free phone call really with either Sean or one of his colleagues. So all of our members can avail themselves of that.
Yeah, and I've heard from lots of members that they really do appreciate that chat with an employment lawyer. And as I so frequently tell our members, I'm not an employment lawyer. I'm not going to give you employment law advice, but I've got a friend who is. So
phone a friend.
And that's you, Sean.
Yes, we just give really sort of 5-minute heads up, 10-minute talk, because often a lot of the issues that arise in the workplace can be worked out, and so if you get a little bit of a heads up, a bit of guidance, or just someone to talk to early on, we can set you on the right path. But if that doesn't work, obviously you'll get to the right people, whether it be the union, ASMs, or an employment lawyer in your area who can help you in a more detailed way.
Yeah. And look, as I say, MPS doesn't normally get involved in those cases unless the regulator, like the Medical Council, is. So the question then is, why are we covering this in a podcast? Sam?
That's a really good question, actually. But the thing about allegations of bullying or harassment, those allegations usually or often arise in the context of a clinical case, and that's where we get involved. And so often there is the whole balance between clinical concerns and personal conduct. And that's why we'll often work with the unions such as ASMS, and we will often pull in one of our lawyers like Sean, who has dual specialties in both health law and employment, just to make sure that we provide really good support for our members. So, yeah, we do get involved to one extent or another.
Yeah, and it is something that often comes up during our advice line calls. So we thought it would be helpful to discuss because, look, often that workplace issues do fall over into patient care. So we thought having a chat about it today might be helpful. So Chow Yen, do you know anything about the studies on this? Have you done any reading on this?
Yeah, so there's a few studies that have been done, and in recent years, bullying in the workplace is I was going to say very topical. I was going to say hot topic, but it's topical.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it doesn't make for wonderful reading. So the statistics are reasonably scary. For example, in 2015, the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons found a high prevalence of bullying and harassment in the Australian and New Zealand health sectors. bullying behaviour proved to be the highest at 38.7% of all respondents having experienced it at some point. And 84.5% of respondents said that the unreasonable behaviour was done by surgical consultants, and 81% said the person exhibiting the behaviour was male. And then Health Dialogue reported a study in 2017 which investigated the prevalence of workplace bullying in just the New Zealand public health system. The study was based on the findings of a survey sent to members of ASMS, of whom 1,759 people responded. 37.2% of respondents reported having been bullied, and 67.5% of respondents reported witnessing bullying of colleagues.
Those are scary numbers, aren't they? You know, that's such a high prevalence.
I think it's quite hard, though, to tease out what might actually be considered bullying, particularly where there are situations where performance management or competency concerns have been raised. And if a team member is not fulfilling their role appropriately, and this is raised by management or by the head of department, the clinician involved can feel bullied. But I'm not sure that you can say that it is bullying.
No, I agree. And more often than not, when a person is being, my experience, when a person's being performance managed, they'll often, and I don't want to say this in a cynical way, but it sort of is a bit, play a bullying card, because one, that's the way they interpret it, and two, it is useful in the context of being a distraction from what is a real issue, which is the performance. So to start this off, I think it's really important that those in a supervisory capacity, obviously performance manage appropriately and are not distracted or put off by that claim, because a lot of people can be, because it often arises in a performance management context.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have had calls from SMOs who say that they've got an underperforming junior doctor, but they won't say anything, precisely because they've got a history of raising this bullying issue. And I can understand that, because it starts a whole HR process. I mean, HR have to take these things seriously, and it puts the SMOs through a quite a stressful time. And those, because I think because the allegations can be hard to disprove, it's almost like they feel tainted by it. So they'd rather just avoid it and not mark down certain doctors.
Look, I can understand that because any performance management process is a really difficult process. I mean, it's probably the most difficult process, because it's saying to a person, you are not performing, which cuts at the very soul of their being. And 9 times out of 10, you get a defensive reaction. But yeah, what happens if you leave it to fester is worse than what you might have to deal with in terms of adopting, with probably HR help or whatever help you can get, an appropriate performance process.
Then the question is, though, as well, what actually is bullying, and how you can avoid being accused of bullying. Because I mean, bullying generally is, when there's personal attacks, being belittled or excluded or humiliated, the use of offensive language towards a person, or sometimes task related, where that person has been given all the worst jobs or the worst roster, constantly criticised. They're being monitored when other people aren't being monitored, and they kind of feel like they're being set up to fail. But I think that unreasonable monitoring thing is always really difficult, because often if you have got someone who there are performance concerns about, it may be reasonable to be monitoring them if there have been incidents. So it's a fine line, isn't it? And the question then is, what's not bullying? I don't know, Chayan, have you had any thoughts about that, about what you'd say is often kind of accused of bullying but isn't?
Yeah, I think it is really hard, because you can imagine if you're not performing so well and you're being told repeatedly that what you're doing is not appropriate, or you feel criticised. And so that can, like Sean was saying before, easily lead to you feeling like you're being bullied. But it's important to be clear that bullying is not a one-off occasion where someone's being tactless towards you, or if they're having a bad day, there's one-off rude comment that you perceive to be directed at you, that's not bullying. Having high performance standards, if your department sets high performance standards for everyone, that's not bullying, because it doesn't apply just to you, it applies to everyone. Constructive feedback or advice, that's not bullying. If it's being framed appropriately and delivered as such, it's not bullying. A request for reasonable work to be done is not bullying. And warnings or disciplinary action in line with agreed code of conduct, a single incident of unreasonable behaviour, or differences of opinion or personality clashes that do not escalate is not bullying. So I understand interpersonal strained relationships become difficult and it's easy to feel targeted. But I think the theme is, if you set it out clearly, you signpost it and you do it early, then you can reasonably explain that you're not trying to bully someone, you're trying to help their performance or give them feedback about their performance.
That's right, Jan. It's a balancing act, isn't it? And so if you start early and you escalate as you're going along, and you've signposted the escalations, then that when you're looking back on that, which is what anyone does when you're analysing whether it's bullying or not, it has a logic to it. Whereas bullying doesn't have a logic to it. So you're having that overlay of logic around the process. The other thing is, at any stage down that line, bringing in an objective person to help you is always a good idea. And then you can't be singled out as being a bully because you've got another objective person coming in and assisting you through it. I mean, that's not, you don't have to do it at the start, but that's sometimes a good idea as you go through the process. But it is a balancing act. But, I think it's very easy to come up with a very good constructive performance process that is insulated from a bullying claim.
But I think one of the problems is that we're not trained in it either. So when you go into a role that requires you to manage other people, you don't know that there's a process, and perhaps you've never been told and you don't know who to ask. So you kind of start giving feedback without realising what you're doing, and then all of a sudden...
And we will have personal styles of how we give feedback as well. And one person's direct style is somebody else's, intimidating style. It's
That's
just,
right.
We may feel we're being direct and the person receiving it may feel we're being rude. Yeah.
And times have changed. There's a lot more, perhaps sensitivity, I suppose, to bullying out there. I mean, I'm an oldie and we had a supervisor, a senior partner who threw a phone at a person once. I mean, you wouldn't get away with that. Now, that wasn't a mobile phone. It was a phone off the wall. So
it's a phone at you,
threw a phone. No,
not at
someone
you.
else. But in those days, I mean, that was wrong and absolutely terrible behaviour. But it was part of, I suppose, what was going on then. But I think today, thankfully, I think we have a higher intolerance to bullying, and so and we need to be far more focused that kind of conduct just doesn't work anymore. It should never have worked, but it certainly doesn't work anymore.
Mm. Okay, so why don't we consider an example? I don't know why I've chosen this name for the person in the example because I'm going to stumble over it now, but Lucretia is the head of department in a well-respected tertiary hospital department. And there's a group of long-standing consultants, but there's also actually been quite a high turnover of junior consultants, some of whom don't seem to have fitted very well with the team culture. So Tom is a new consultant, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and keen to get his teeth into his first consultant job. And look, initially, Lucretia seems really supportive and she's the font of all wisdom. She's a great colleague to have around when you're new. It helps you get on with understanding how things work in that department. But after 3 months, Tom felt that she had changed and seemed to be constantly putting him down in the team meetings and discounting or belittling his opinions. Tom had actually just come back from an overseas fellowship and was keen to get his new ideas incorporated into the department's clinical practice. But everything he suggested was turned down. And Lucretia seemed to take it as a personal affront if he brought a new paper along to their team meeting, which didn't agree with the department's current practice. There were multiple incidents over a number of years where Tom felt undermined and disrespected, and it all came to a head when Tom saw a patient for a particular procedure, and the patient unfortunately experienced a common but significant complication. Lucretia was very critical of the care he had provided in an open team meeting, and Tom kind of suspected that she'd talked to the patient, who went on to make a formal HDC complaint. When initially, after Tom had talked to them, they'd seemed to understand that it was a recognised complication and wasn't due to negligence. MPS assisted Tom with the HDC complaint, but he remained concerned that Lucretia had actually precipitated that complaint, and he wanted advice on how to reduce his risk in the future.
This is a really difficult situation for a relatively junior consultant to find themselves in. And it could be that there is an untouchable senior clinician who is tolerated because of their seniority and experience, but who can display inappropriate behaviour towards more junior members of the team. And I guess the question is, are HR ever going to listen to concerns about a consultant who has, worked in a department, got an exemplary employment record for the last 20 or 30 years, and who is working tirelessly on the on-call roster, etc., etc.? Do you think that HR would ever do anything about that?
That's a difficult question. I think, going back to my previous answer, I think more and more the answer is yes. I think more and more now there's an intolerance of bullying, and the consequences of bullying, with fines, with workplace, are becoming higher and more well known. So I think maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the answer would be, well, probably never. But I think there's more of a feeling that sort of conduct can't get on. So I think Tom could escalate it if he wanted to, and I think that it would be in a lot of situations that I've seen now taken up and looked at and considered.
Yeah, we don't even know if Lucretia says anything to the patient, do we? The problem is Tom is feeling so under attack that he's kind of extrapolating that so that he feels like everything is stacked against him and, everything's a concern. So, and I think when we're in that situation, it's really understandable to feel that way, that we feel like that person is adversely influencing our patients against us, but we don't actually know that that's true. So I don't know. Cheyenne, how do you think Tom should start with this?
Yeah, I think it can be really tricky. If he is comfortable to, often the best place to start is with the person who you have a problem with. Like I say, that's not easy, but if he can prepare well for the conversation and try to communicate honestly about how he's feeling and suggest some possible ways to improve the situation, hopefully some progress can be made. Because in reality, we want to feel valued within the team. I'm sure he doesn't want to feel like he's under attack, so therefore he's going to attack Lucretia back and make her lose her job and make her go through an HR process. I think he just wants to feel valued. So I think it would be very useful if he's comfortable to note down what's happening, objective examples of what's been happening, and find a time to talk to Lucretia about it.
I wonder if it's worthwhile, before he even decides to approach her, to speak to another senior colleague and get their independent view. I think it's so easy for us to look at things through the wrong lens, whereas someone else objectively might be able to say, well, actually, yeah, that was a little bit rough, but I don't think it was bullying, or, this is where I think that this doctor was going with it. I mean, I've had cases where you've got a relatively junior colleague who feels picked on, and they might be struggling with certain things, or struggling with the stresses of the job and not coping very well, and when that's picked up as a clinical concern, in their distress, can feel like, and I've seeing it now where they're saying, oh, actually, they're just bullying me. Yes, I've not managed this patient particularly well, but I was really stressed, but they're picking on me anyway, and they're making my life harder. Whereas it's interesting as, sitting back in my role, helping them, on paper it looks like, actually, no, they have been trying to help you. But the doctor's obviously so distressed that they can't see that. And so I think getting an independent, more objective view is actually really useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think you should do something, because letting it snowball, you end up losing your enjoyment of your job, and so often, if you don't speak up, you start second guessing yourself. Avoidable mistakes start happening. You have days off work because you're not feeling good. You avoid them, so you're not going to go to the meetings, and so you don't catch up with what the news is. The whole thing starts to snowball into a really toxic workplace. So I think, if possible, it is best to actually address it and try and stop that at the start, as Sean said earlier, and because at the end of the day, patient care will get affected in the end if colleagues aren't talking to each other. Yeah. Yeah, but what about if the person talking to the person directly doesn't actually improve the situation? What about that then? If you've tried talking to them and it doesn't work, nothing's improved.
I think there does come a point where you must be able to raise it with HR. Sean, do you have any thoughts around exactly when the best time to do that is in the process?
Well, it's really hard to pinpoint a time. I think when he feels that nothing he's done previously has worked, and obviously at that point he's probably starting to feel really under stress. I think at that point he needs EAP or counselling help, and I think he does need to raise it with HR. But also your point before of getting a objective colleague, someone he trusts, to confide in is also a great idea. So I think those three things work in tandem, and but it's difficult to pinpoint a time because everyone's different. Some people are robust, they're resilient, they'll just take on the chin and work it through. Others less so. So it's not a one size fits all answer. I'm sorry.
The employer must have an obligation to respond. Would that be true?
Absolutely. Once it's raised with HR, the obligation will be to see it through, and because it will be the obligation then will be on the employer to do something about it to make sure that it's resolved. Otherwise, they're acting in bad faith or they're not meeting their obligations to an employee. So they will. That's why I came back to that point before. They will take it seriously. And they will try and resolve it. And then you've got the possibility of that restorative process coming into play, or at least a meeting that's managed that gets the two parties together and tries to get an understanding of. So, coming back to my first question, the sooner the better, probably.
So in this particular case, Tom was so distressed that he actually ended up taking personal leave and saw a psychologist for the first time in his life. He did raise his concerns with HR, and Lucretia then also raised concerns about Tom's competence and communication skills, which is so often the case, isn't it? When one person complains, the other person complains. So a long investigation ensued. Tom's clinical practice was reviewed, but no specific concerns were uncovered. And eventually, actually, Lucretia was put on gardening leave and she then retired. Luckily, this case never went to the medical council, but it's not uncommon for these kind of cases to end up at the medical council, where colleagues end up accusing each other of unprofessional behaviour.
Lucy, it's interesting, going back to the fixed scenario, and something we could just talk about Lucretia for a second, because one of the things I saw in there was the belittling around others, and that the theme that comes from in bullying all the time is a lot of supervisors see the need to belittle, and I won't use the word belittle, I'll use the word criticize in public, which is so much more of a damaging thing, and also isn't as useful. And so if you've got a criticism to make, to do that offline or to do it in a safer setting, because it is humiliating. If you think about it yourself, it is humiliating being criticised in front of others, it makes it so much worse. So my advice to people who are supervising is think about it very carefully. There are times when you're going to have to make a comment in a public setting, which is fine, and they will occur. But more often than not, if you are going to make a criticism about someone, you can actually say, hey, look, let's have a coffee, or hey, I think you could have done that better, and this is how you do it. And something given on a one-on-one basis like that will be so much better received, or more often than not, than if you're doing it in front of others and putting a person down in front of others.
Well, if you think about the way ward rounds are structured in these teaching hospitals,
That's right.
I can't imagine that would ever happen where you pulled aside and say, well, actually, you were wrong answering that question. I still have memories of, when you feel humiliated.
PTSD from the ward rounds as a medical student.
Being asked questions that you have no idea what the answer is and that kind of thing. And I think it's actually very common.
Yes, and it was kind of, and we were the same. It's in law school or in court. It happens with them, or in meetings, where we were taught by humiliation of it, and that was fine. I'm just wondering if it's possible, if you think about it in future, that actually a criticism given one-on-one is going to be more effective in terms of actually getting the person to agree and to get better. And secondly, it avoids the possibility of that bullying, humiliation, threat potential later on.
And often ward round teaching still does happen, but I think the ones I've seen, questions are posed generally, and if someone can't give you an answer, the student next to them, if they can, they give an answer and they discuss it in general, and they don't always do it in front of the patient as well. So I hope that's more constructive now in general than it was back then, because I agree, I hated those ward rounds because I never knew the answers.
Yeah.
Well, I still remember it was on an orthopaedic run, and we were in was it an 8-bed or a 6-bed, one of those massive rooms, where the consultant is basically shouting at the registrar, dressing him down in front of patients as well as the rest of the team, and we were a big team. And you just think how awful, and the registrar left orthopaedic shortly after, and it's not surprising. But yeah, I would hope that sort of thing doesn't happen.
So the Medical Council does have a statement on unprofessional behaviour, and it starts with a statement that, as a doctor, you have an obligation to be respectful and professional, as your behaviour may affect how a health team functions, how care is delivered to patients, and the public's trust and confidence in the medical profession. If you have concerns about the conduct, competence, or safety of a doctor's practice, you should notify the Medical Council. Now, I don't think we're going to say that everyone should run off and notify the Medical Council when you get shouted at on a ward round, but it is interesting that clearly the Medical Council think that we shouldn't be shouting at people on ward rounds. That's clearly not considered to be appropriate, and it can affect how the team functions and how patient care is delivered. So, yes, obviously the Medical Council say you can tell them, but it's generally not going to be our first port of call, is it? And definitely better to get things resolved at a local level as if we can, because once the Medical Council get involved, often the process is quite long-winded. There's lots of writing backwards and forwards, getting character references from your colleagues, and it actually can be really difficult to rebuild trusting collegial relationships once everybody's been down that road. The council don't actually tell us everything that's unprofessional behaviour, but clearly bullying, discrimination, racism and rudeness are considered unprofessional and should be not part of the way we deal with each other.
I think you raised a good point just then, Lucy, around whether you escalate matters or at what point you should escalate matters and how much of it you should put up with, so to speak. Because New Zealand is a very small community, particularly when you're involved in healthcare. And it can be difficult. For example, if you're a registrar, you've got to get that job. You've got to get a consultant job, and reputations travel, word travels, and I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't raise concerns. I guess it's a question of the threshold for when we should do it, because if we step back and think, what's my ultimate goal? My ultimate goal is to get a good consultant position. I guess sometimes we need to think carefully about whether our next actions are going to stop that from happening or make it harder. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sean?
Look, I agree. I mean, and again, it's really hard to do this in the hypothetical, but healthcare is a difficult environment, a stressful environment, and day-to-day incidents will occur, where you need a little bit of resilience and deal with them and just move on. And having that judgment to know when that's happened. If you're going to be jumping at every time you think something's bad's been said about you or someone shouted at you or maybe raise their voice, then you may not be suitable for the environment that you're, or making yourself unsuitable for the environment you're living in. So there's a judgment call there that needs to be made, because yes, it is a stressful environment. Yes, it is a challenging environment, and you'll need a certain amount of resilience to deal with it.
I mean, that said, on the other side, if you need to raise concerns, you need to raise concerns. And, I've been involved in a case where it wasn't bullying and harassment, but it was more of I don't know what you call that, it was more of a sexual harassment, if you like, of young doctors. And a number of them hadn't said anything. They'd kept quiet, so nobody knew until one junior doctor had said, "This has happened to me." And it was only once she took that brave step that it came out that actually there were a number of other doctors in her situation that had been approached by this particular male doctor. And then something was able to be done. So I guess it's we're not saying don't say anything and you have to suck it up. That's not actually what we're saying. It's really around being wise about the decisions you make along the way.
I think that there should be an incredibly low threshold for any sexual harassment notification or claim. That's sort of a different issue. There is no. I'm not suggesting that there's a threshold. I think it's a very low threshold for that. But I think that in a workplace setting, there are often days when you can be grumped at maybe once or twice, or people can raise their voice, and not every situation like that should be raised as a bullying. It's when that is constant, when it's over a period of time, that you at some stage along that continuum you should be saying, "Hey, enough's enough," and I'm going to raise this as a bullying complaint.
And I do think we can't say, "Oh, they're not resilient enough." It's a little bit almost victim blaming. I mean, yes, you need a certain level of resilience of dealing with, when things go wrong and, when days are challenging. But actually, I think it's really important that if someone is being victimized, that actually we don't blame them for their lack of resilience. That doesn't seem fair either. So there's a happy medium somewhere in the middle, isn't there?
Yeah, and what we haven't talked about, which I'll just raise, is the people in the room who are seeing the bullying also being responsible for raising that also with either the person who's been bullied or the person who's doing the bullying, and taking some sort of collective responsibility for what's happening. Because a lot of people will observe it and sit back and not do anything about it. And that I think is another issue.
That's so true. And actually, as the observer, you're in a much better position to actually judge whether it is bullying or not, because you can actually see it from the outside. Yeah, that's very, very true. And I think Sam's point about, getting references for the next job and all those things, often there are big drivers that stop people standing up and actually calling it out when they see these things. But I think it is important that they do, yeah.
It's a really difficult. I think this discussion highlights really how difficult it is, because we've had colleagues make complaints because they overheard someone raise their voice slightly about their dissatisfaction about another case being cancelled. So then they got a big complaint about that because colleague A, let's say, thought that they were observing bullying behaviour, so they should speak up.
Right.
So it just becomes so difficult, and it's such a tricky situation to navigate.
Can I come back to that, because I answered Sam before about the fact that HR will take these on. Often there's not a triaging process that says, actually, I'm not going to take this on. This is silly. Go away. Because everyone's so risk averse now, HR will go, "Oh, a complaint's made. I have to go through the motions. I have to make sure I'm ticking every box and taking this in." And even at times getting an independent investigator in, and the whole thing becomes bigger than Ben Hur, when really, a threshold wasn't crossed. And so you're absolutely right. These things unfortunately get a life of their own when sometimes they don't deserve it.
Absolutely. And in those circumstances, it became bigger than Ben-Hur. And it really upset the person who was just expressing, I understand, I get that it was probably inappropriate to raise their voice, but they weren't directing it at one particular person. They were showing their frustration. And they felt so disheartened by the whole process that, as a result, they're not really working that much now, and their skills are lost. So I think this discussion really highlights how difficult it is to navigate. And when you want to speak up, there's going to be thorns, and if you don't speak up, there's thorns. So talk to someone.
But I do think that takes us back to that original issue, that is, if you can, talk to the person involved. So, if your colleague had actually talked to the doctor who was frustrated and shouting and said, gosh, I saw you shouting and I was worried because I thought that was a bit inappropriate. Can you tell me more about what happened? And actually listened, it may never have been sent to HR.
100%.
So it's actually raised the issue with the person involved first is the message from that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so just before we end, I thought it would be good to have a little brief chat about working with a narcissist, because often we have all these strategies for talking to people and talking through things, but sometimes our normal strategies don't seem to work with some particular colleagues, and we end up considering, is the reason in this case it's not working because this person is a narcissist? And if that's true, do I need to change my approach in that situation? So, Sam, do you know what the definition of a narcissist is? Have you?
Yeah, I understand it's a personality disorder in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, and they have troubled relationships and a lack of empathy for others. It was interesting, I was talking to another doctor not very long ago, and he was telling me that he's looked into narcissism and done some written work on it. And he was saying that actually all of us have some narcissistic traits, and that in fact doctors have to have some narcissistic traits in order to cope with the job.
Maybe
I found that so encouraging. But I think there is a DSM-4 definition, and you have to have all of the traits in order to be said that you're a narcissist.
Yeah, and I think so often in medicine, we tend to reward people who do exhibit the qualities of a narcissist, those people who are very confident and speak very well, and we think, oh gosh, they must know everything. And we often do that, mistaking confidence for competence issue, and also that arrogance for achievement. And it's very easy for those people to actually go quite far in medicine because of their confidence. So, sometimes they are very, they've got quite high up in the chain, and they can be very charming, and their positivity about themselves and their confidence actually can be a very attractive kind of quality.
My experience of them in law, there's a few in law, is that they're very insecure as well. And the other thing is that a lot of them, they love the people they love. So if you're in their orbit, you're absolutely perfect. If you're not in there, you're a 1 or a 2. If you're a 0 or a 1, I suppose. And the other thing is, I think we all find confrontation. We can do confrontation, but it drains us. Whereas there are some narcissists who actually get a buzz out of confrontation. It actually fills them up. And so the way I've always felt I deal with them is you don't jump into their sample. You don't play the aggression game with them, because they're just better at it. And they enjoy it, and so you just don't play that game with them. And you always I even can be accused of being condescending. Just stay away from it and leave it alone and say, oh, you must be having a bad day. Sorry, well, let's talk about it later. And you deal with them in an incredibly calm way, which actually annoys them a lot more. But I think that's the way to do it, because otherwise, if you try and take them on head on, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, and I think they very rarely accept feedback.
No.
A lot of us, when we get told, oh, I think you should have done that way, we think, oh my God, I did it the wrong way. I'll have to change. It was all my fault. Whereas actually, I think that some people with those narcissistic traits, their instant thought is, no, I didn't. no, I did it the right way. No. and it's quite difficult sometimes to then actually give feedback to people like that, because actually you are trying to be helpful, and you are actually trying to show them ways in which they can improve, but it's so far beyond their understanding that they could improve that actually, and maybe Sean, your thing about insecurity is part of that they actually find it very hard to accept that maybe they had done something wrong, which can make it very, very difficult to deal with.
I think we see a lot of our members when they've received a significant complaint about a clinical concern, that a lot of us do feel defensive. And I think it's natural, and it's quite hard to fight that, because facing the fact that we've made a big error where someone perhaps has died or, something along those lines is actually very difficult to accept as a person.
It is.
I think.
It is. So, Chayan, can you think of any ways that we could actually approach dealing with narcissists? Is there something that you think that might be useful to try?
So, like Sean was saying before, working out a communication strategy to deal with them when they're confrontational. Manage your expectations. Like you were saying, Lucy, if they're unlikely going to be apologetic or take on board the feedback, they might accept that there might be no mutual resolution to conflicts. And you can definitely, I'd start with a compassionate approach. So they didn't choose to be a narcissist, and their journey in life will be a difficult one. So if your starting point is that it's difficult for everyone, and we all have narcissistic traits, that this will be difficult for them to hear. So I might try talking to them about what's difficult for them at the moment. Perhaps something's happened in their personal life, or they've got a schedule, or they've got difficult circumstances right now. So try and understand what's difficult before framing your feedback to them. And again, delivering it in a way that's objective and not in a personal way will be helpful. And I think recognising your own feelings and try to get some perspective of why they're behaving the way they are.
Yeah, I think it can be. That's often the thing that's hardest, isn't it? When you're expecting the interaction to go one way and it goes another way, and you think, well, where am I in this? What have I done? But actually, if you can say, look, I did my best. Maybe there's nothing more I could have done, but I tried and I listened. I think that is probably, and that you're not going to change them necessarily. And then you've got to decide how are you going to live in your practice or department or whatever it is, with that person as they are, because it may be that there won't be a change.
You can sort of turn it around a little bit, and this is easier said than done. But it's one of those situations where it's not me, it's him, or it's not me, it's her. You can actually discount the criticism, discount the conduct, by saying, actually, this is just the way he or she is, and in fact, you can if you reduce the impact of it on you and say, look, this is just the way this person operates, and presumably with a lot of people, and you can actually get together and say, hey, I've had a phone thrown at me by such and such, and I did that. He did it to me for 3 years. If you get that collegiality, that'll help. So support, but also you can actually distance yourself from it by saying, look, I'm doing everything right. I'm not going to let him or her upset me or diminish my confidence, because it's their problem, not mine. So that's always a useful way of dealing with them as well.
The question always is in medicine is what, when it's having such an adverse effect on your department that patient care is
that's when you escalate it.
And then you have to escalate. And then that's that thing about trying to write down the facts when there's actually an incident happened, that you've written it down, so that when it comes to escalating it, you actually have got some facts to go on. Okay, so look, we've talked about all sorts of things about difficult workplaces, and I'm not sure we've come to a very happy ending, really, have we? I don't know. Have you got anything more that you wanted to talk about today, Sam or Chayan?
I'd probably encourage our listeners to know that if you're finding it confusing and difficult to navigate, it's because it is, and that's okay. And that there is always advice that you can get. So you can either ring MPS, you can speak to an employment lawyer, you could speak to your union, you could speak to a senior colleague, and start there. And if you get good advice, then you will find a path forward.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's important when you're dealing with these situations is to approach each of them with an open mind and without preconceived ideas, and focus on the goal. And the goal is good patient care, happy department. How are we going to achieve that? And that's what you've got to keep in your sights for how am I going to achieve good patient care and a happy department? That's a good thing that most of us hopefully will all agree on. So thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it's been helpful. If you like Medical Protection podcasts, please subscribe and leave a review. If you'd like a podcast on a specific topic, please email nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org. So thank you for coming along today, Sean and Sam.
My pleasure.
And Chaoyen. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you, Lucy.
And see you all again next time.
Bye now.